Broadcasting live from the land of Gym Bros, this is the Monstrous Feminine podcast, the film club where we dissect the eerie intersections of gender in horror. My name is Mila, and I'm joined by my muscle mommies,
Louisa,
Tyia, and Zeba.
This month we are doing a one-off single episode Pride special. We of course had to choose the gory gay 2024 thriller Love Lies Bleeding, directed by Rose Glass. This episode is extra special because we are joined by Reem, who you might remember was our Witch of the Week on our episode covering Children of the Corn. Reem is a designer, writer, and archive rat based in Paris. Their work focuses on the long history of what might be called moral panic entertainment, from exploitation films to video games. They are also one half of Gross Encounters, a workshop, festival, and film screening club that engages with the politics of monstrosity and alienhood by honouring lowbrow, low-budget, and low-resolution horror and sci-fi productions, their fandoms, and their scholars. Before we get into the film, go ahead and follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or the Apple Podcast app. You can find all of our links on our Instagram at The Monstrous Feminine Podcast.
Love Lies Bleeding follows a bodybuilder named Jackie who passes through a small town in New Mexico on her way to a bodybuilding competition in Las Vegas. Jackie secures a temporary job at the town's local gun range after sleeping with one of its sleazy employees named JJ to get a referral. Jackie attends a gym to train and catches the eye of its reclusive manager, Lou. Jackie tells Lou of her plans, and Lou fatefully offers Jackie steroids, which she injects for the first time. The pair have an instant attraction, and after spending a passionate night together, it is agreed that Jackie will stay with Lou while she's in town. However, Lou's family has a criminal past. It turns out the gun range is owned by Lou's estranged gangster father, Lou Sr., and JJ is revealed to be Lou's horrifically abusive brother-in-law. Their relationship descends into chaos as the pair try to overcome the sudden whirlwind of violence.
Au naturel, baby.
Right. Your body, your choice. You want to do a little bit? 150 is kind of the smallest dose you can do, and if you have 4 weeks, you'll barely notice it, but it'll build up gradually and just give you that little edge. Where you want it?
In the butt.
So first I want to welcome Reem. We're so excited to have you here today. This is our first ever guest on the show, so you guys can guess how special Reem is to us from that.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really terrified right now because it's my first podcast ever, but really excited about the discussions we're about to have.
Oh my gosh, podcast virgin.
We're so excited to have you on.
Oh gosh, I am endlessly jealous. It keeps me up at nights that we haven't gotten to hang out and that I was not at Gross Encounters. So this is making up for a little bit, but I don't know. We'll have to rectify that.
So we were reached out to by lovely Reem and Noam, who are the co-founders and organizers of Gross Encounters. And then Ty and I were lucky enough to go in person to do the festival and meet Reem and Noam. And it was so amazing and special. And yeah, we did a few posts about it, but that's our history.
So Gross Encounters initially started out as a workshop that Noam and I used to run in art and design schools like for the past 3-4 years now. And so like last year was the first time we decided to like organize an event like a festival. And then to start meeting some of the people whose work we really were both fans of. You were definitely on that list, which is why we reached out. We hope to step outside of that elitist arts and culture studies realm and to try to organize more stuff in like other spheres as well, surrounding like the joys we find in horror and sci-fi.
That really resonated with us, I think, because we tried to find that balance between academic text heavy theory and then something that's accessible and fun as well. Good fit, dare I say. Best friends forever.
The meeting of minds?
Since we're doing Love Lives Leading on this episode, do you guys think that you are a ride or die in the sense of the way that Jackie was or Lou was in the film? I can already tell you, in my mind, I think I am, but in practice, I am not.
I actually think like her name being Lou was very distracting for me because I was like, the way I would not be in this situation, and I felt like I was being referred to in this movie because they're like Lou, 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 and yeah, just to say no, absolutely not. I'm not a ride or die. If you need someone to help you bury a body, I'm not that bitch. I will not. I will panic. I'm not into it. I think I would duck out really quick in this scenario.
I'm thinking Zeba's gonna say yes.
I think so, yeah.
You're most likely to get into a situation like this.
I think you're correct. Like, sadly, the answer is probably yes. I was watching the movie and I was thinking no, but in reflection of me and my own life, like, honestly, I can see myself getting as far as like rolling the thing up in the rug, and like, I don't know if I can't drive, so I would be useless moving the body anywhere.
A ride along or die.
Yeah, a passenger princess, if you will, to whatever chaos ensues. Like, I'm not gonna leave you, but I might not help. You know what I mean?
I feel like I would have gotten to like the first one because JJ kind of sucked, and I would have been like, you know what, I understand, like, we can do this together. But then when we got to the second one, I'm like, you know what, I think this is becoming a problem. I simply can't go to prison. I think maybe this is a new hobby that I can't support at this time. I can't go to prison for this.
The thing is, once you've already covered up one murder, what's another?
I mean, I think she can argue in like JJ's case, since he has like a history of violence, I think they could have got away with self-defense there.
Against her? No way.
I mean, it's not his fault that she's a muscle mommy.
We need to know Reem's.
Reem, are you a ride or die? I need to know your psychological profile.
Not out of my own choosing, but I do expect someday a friend to show up at my doorstep with a body.
You expect?
Yeah.
Reem's like, I've got somebody in mind, actually.
A matter of time before it happens. Yeah.
It's not an if, it's a when.
I would definitely do it for a friend, but not a partner that I'd met like a few weeks ago.
Fair.
Best I will do is keep it a secret, and that's saying something for me because I love to gossip, love a little bit of tea.
I'm a yapper. I think I'd fuck it up by accident.
I would for sure tell my mom or my sister.
Yeah, I'd be sending little voice memos to everyone I know about where's the body. I drop a pin.
To be honest, I relate to the idea of spur of the moment impulsive violence. If someone came to me, they were like, they really pissed me off, and I just accidentally killed them. I'd be like, I get you. Let's get this sorted.
The first one was that. The second one was more premeditated.
I mean, she did quite literally rip his jaw off of his body.
I'd be like, oh my god, he tripped. He's so clumsy.
Also, I would never call the cops. So, like, with that in mind, I'm a natural accomplice.
To be fair, I think I am genuinely way too afraid of going to prison for this. Like, in my mind, I think I would be like, oh my god, I'm so down, like, I'm ready to help you. But if someone came to me with this, I would immediately have a panic attack and, like, start crying and be like, oh my god.
Yeah, the anxious generation doesn't work well with this.
The Monstrous Feminine is on Spotify, so please rate us 5 stars and comment on our episodes. If you do engage with our content, you might just get a shout out in our next episode as our Witch of the Week. This episode, our Witch of the Week is mine, Tyia, who commented on our Ma episode and said, Ma coming onto Ben's son feels very Jacob Renesmee imprint coded to me. Whoa. I actually did not read this comment ahead of time. My mind is reeling at the ramifications of that.
I think it's a very fitting episode to have this comment because it's a Twilight reference and we're doing another Kristen Stewart film.
Her legacy. Yeah, I guess I can see that. I don't know if she had like imprinted on, what was it? Was she at the egg? It was the egg. It was within Bella, so he thought he liked Bella, but really it was Renesmee all along. I think Ma's a revenge fantasy in a way that, like, I don't think she was, really in love with that man. I think she wanted to kill him, and did. So, different impulse. If there's a kind of imprinting that instead you want to take care of them, that you want to kill them, then perhaps. Maybe it's like nature versus nurture. I think this was a nurture type of situation, whereas Renesmee was, by nature, he imprinted on her. I'd have to give this some more thought, honestly.
You've given it quite a lot of thought, actually.
Happy Pride Month.
Yeah, I hope that you feel proud all month long and that you have a great summertime. Friendly reminder that we're also on Patreon and Substack. You can find all of our links and information on our social media. Please support us. Any contribution helps.
The reason we chose this film is because I threatened to quit the podcast if we didn't do this film for Pride Month. So I may or may not have been a brat, but also I have no regrets. And I had a really good time. And I can't wait to talk to you guys about this.
Actually, I saw the film when it first came out in the US because I was there on a family trip. So it was like a couple months ago. I was in Los Angeles. And I went alone to the theater because I didn't want to have family members with me.
A good choice for this one, I would argue.
And I think like it was a fun watch, but like next day I kind of like the whole film slipped my mind. Like I didn't give it a second thought, and I had to like dig through these memories for like to prepare this.
I mean, I saw it today, so I feel like I won't know if I share that until tomorrow.
What time did you go see this movie?
11 a.m. to a dog-friendly screening. It was very sweet. And actually, there was a pug that was like, you know, pugs, the way they breathe heavily. It only happened like at the very beginning. And I was honestly like, same pug. Like, we're all panting over here. That opening montage.
I would say I had a similar experience to Reem where, like, honestly, I had to watch 3 different YouTube videos of people, like, talking about this film to be like, oh yeah, that did happen. It's really fun, though.
Mine was, like, super audience interactive. Like, there were gasps, there were giggles, there were actual verbal comments. Like, when the giant scene happened, I was just like, what? Like, you know, like, little exclamations. It was a very verbal screening that I went to.
Quite a lot of laughter in mine, actually. There were other parts where I think people were very quiet, either because it was intense or because people were obviously very transfixed by the leading actors of this film. Yeah.
So I watched it alone. I streamed it. So I've been on a spin-off episode. As y'all know, my roommates have been gone for a week, so I've been doing a lot of alone things. So I thought about seeing this alone in theaters because I watched Challengers alone in theaters. And I don't go to movies alone. I don't do anything alone. This has been a very challenging time for me. But I remembered when y'all didn't tell me anything about Handmaiden and I watched it in the common areas of my apartment, and then it started, you know, getting pornographic. So I had that thought. I was like, okay, either I see this in mixed company at a theater, which I've been, you know, pushing myself to do. But then I was like, no, I'm going to watch this in my space, in my area, when no one is around, just in case you fuckers didn't warn me again.
It sounds like you wanted to do that for a different reason.
No, I did not find this as pearl grasping as Handmaiden, so I didn't need to do all that. I think I could have watched it in a common area.
We're inferring it's something a little bit more intimate than pearl clutching.
Yeah, you know.
Oyster clutching?
I don't know what the kids are calling it nowadays. Whatever the situation is, I think I could have watched this in a theater and I would have been all right. Like, I think that if you're particularly into like this kind of thing, like if the muscle mommies are like something you were interested in prior to watching this, and like sure, maybe you would be feeling a little hot under the collar in a theater. But otherwise, I was like, yeah, bodies are so cool, aren't they? I love women. And like, I don't know.
Women!
Women can do whatever they want. They can kill. They can make mistakes, right?
I support women's wrongs.
I was supporting women's wrongs. What can I say?
So I didn't know I was into muscle mommies until the promo. And I was like, oh, I need to see this movie. I think this film awoke an interest in muscle mommies I didn't realize I had.
I can't remember what photo shoot it was, but it is with Katie O'Brien and Kristen Stewart, who are just all over each other. They did well for this promo. Like, they knew exactly what they were doing. They always had that sort of sweaty 80s vibe to it.
I think Kristen Stewart was greasing her hair. I was like, why are you so greased up?
So into greasy Kristen Stewart. I mean, I'm into normal Kristen Stewart, but yeah, it awoke a lot of things.
I think this is normal Kristen Stewart. I feel like this was a self-insert.
Well, actually, Rose Glass wrote it with Kristen in mind. Maybe I just don't know film history enough, or I haven't seen a film. But from my personal experience, I hadn't seen like a mainstream film showcase like muscly women's bodies in a way that was like super, I'm going to say sexualized, but like in a good way.
Erotic.
That's the word when you want to get away with objectification. Erotic. Where I was like, no, but I think it's like more celebratory of like different bodies and different way women can appear. And I was really into it. I was into it for feminist reasons, guys. It's interesting like how this film came to be, and it basically began with just Rose Glass wanting to write about a bodybuilder and thinking there's like a weird, should we say, like chasm in the psychology of it. And I'm going to read a quote which is from an interview that Rose Glass did with Dazed this year. And she says that I've always been interested in bodies and relationships that people have with their own ones, and what those relationships can say about a person's mindset, how they see themselves, how they see the world. Did they take care of their body? Did they destroy it? The initial thing that started this whole idea off was thinking it would be fascinating to tell a story about a woman who's trying to be a bodybuilder and how she's trying to become almost untouchable and strong. But it's so contradictory because it's also an aesthetic desire. I've always felt this weird disconnect between our brains and our bodies. Like in your mind, you can feel so grand and encompass so much. And yet on some level, we're also confined to these weird fleshy vessels, which can be wrong, be inelegant, and suffer. And in another interview with British Vogue, again, she calls bodybuilding like a competitive sport, but also talks about how it's an aesthetic sport and was wondering about the psychology it takes to do something like that. And then she also talks about how in an interview with Empire, she talks about how she wanted to really take down this idea of this strong female character because she thinks it's a cliche and it's very shallow. And the idea of like embodying that literally with a bodybuilder was kind of fertile ground for her to explore this. And I think it's really, going back to my own thoughts about it, I think it's a really interesting like literalization and then kind of subversion. And yeah, I also just really like the idea of playing with the dichotomy between like your body as being a point of strength, but also a sport that makes it objectified in the most literal way. I mean, it's referred to as bodybuilding, like you are a component that is put together and you're basically on stage to be admired. And I think that's all like really interesting and does like a lot of interesting things with like, I don't want to say female gaze because we talk about it so much, but and like take it down so much. It's like, what does that even fucking mean? But yeah, it is just like a really interesting lens and gaze to have.
I was going to the earlier part of the quote that you mentioned about like her wanting to be strong as in like a weapon, like she's trying to make her body into a weapon. We don't get a whole lot of backstory. We just know that like maybe she's done some violent things before and her family doesn't want her back, but that she's like had a hard time of it. And like, you know, the way I interpreted her actions was like, oh, she just like feels really unsafe and really insecure, and she like wants to both appear strong and be strong to protect herself. And then there's this whole element of the guns and like the gun range of it all. And she's like, why would I need a gun when I can take care of myself? And like we see her punch a man and a man punches her back. I think that was really like a jarring moment for me because I'm never used to like a man just like sucker punching a woman. Like it just, and like there's the element of the domestic violence thing, but I was like, whoa, I can't believe he did that. Like, even though she is clearly could take him, she can hold her own against him. I believe if they got into a fight, like she could have taken care of herself. It was still really upsetting to watch a man just like outwardly punch a woman and like nobody stop him. Like all of his friends just like let it happen. And then she's having this conversation with Lou's dad about guns. And I think about guns a lot. I mean, I live in America. Of course I think about guns. Like I grew up in a household that had guns. It felt like a very necessary thing. And it was like something that I was taught, like, as a woman, you can, not should, but you can have a gun. Like, it's an option. And I'm also like a person, like I'm very tiny person. I live in a big city. I keep weapons on me. I have knives on me. I have pepper spray on me. I have all types of like self-defense things on me at all times. I take self-defense classes, or like I have. My school made sure we did them before we graduated high school. Something about appearing like you can defend yourself is not enough. Right? Beth had the option of, I guess, like reporting it. She was not going to defend herself. The existence of all these like men around and guns around, and her father's fucking kills people for a living, and he at no point thought that he was going to kill her husband for her. It felt like a Sisyphean like task to be big enough that like you could defend yourself against this world as a woman. And in the end, I don't know where I stand on it. Like the aesthetics of it are really interesting to me because I noticed that when she gets to Vegas and she's looking around, everybody's spray tanning. Like they're contouring themselves to look stronger. that's a very different aim. And like you know, even the men are like etching their abs in, and and I know in bodybuilding, like they eat in a very particular way the week leading up to a training, so they have like 0% body fat, and then the second the competition is over, they like go back to eating a normal amount again. But it's just about looking stronger. They're actually physically very weak and very sick in the weeks like of a competition. So I don't know. There's a lot with the like visuals to unpack here, but I've never ever like thought about gender in relation to like the aesthetics of being strong, because I've always thought like, okay, so what, you look strong, like they're still gonna commit violences against you, surely. I don't think that is enough. And a man feels emasculated by a woman who thinks she is stronger or is stronger. So I never felt like she was safe. And that was like the constant anxiety for me. Like even when she's roided out and the, you know, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, I'm like, they still have guns, girl. They're gonna shoot you. Doesn't matter if you're taller than all the buildings. Like maybe that's very American of me, but like, yeah, it's an American movie. The guns felt like a big part of it.
I have like a lot of similar comments based on what you said, Louisa and Zeba. There was like, I think what you said about that scene, the opening scene where she punches that guy in the face in the gym. I thought that was really interesting because it's the first time where we kind of get that, like her recklessness and impulsiveness, but also fearlessness in her character. And like you quickly understand that this is going to be a sort of a revenge movie type of structure thing. But usually like a lot of these, whether it's a rape revenge movie, if you're looking at the most exploitative ones, or like more mainstream revenge movies, a lot of the times you have a lot of like misogynistic tropes that are applied to the women's carrying out the revenge, because you always have that second act where they're plotting out and carefully planning everything and being extremely mindful about, you know, how they're gonna carry everything out. And usually they use, like, as you mentioned, weapons or tricks or ruse, or you have a lot of use of drugs and poisoning their aggressors as well. Whereas in this one, everything is like so impulsive, and you feel that, like, you have that character who's Jackie, like everybody, like every other female character who has been through some like terrible shit throughout her whole life and has been accumulating that rage and that like she could snap at any moment, because she built herself to be strong, to like defend herself and stand up for herself, but at the same time like she kind of over relies on that and does not need to like plot things out and like, you know, just goes with it. And I felt that was like a pretty interesting flip of the script that you kind of find in these revenge movies. And that I also thought that there were a lot of references there from exploitation movies, because you see a lot of these larger than life, super muscular women who like start fights like on parking lots and stuff in movies, and a lot of like sexploitation films, which I personally adore and I'm a huge fan of. Yeah, I mean, we can talk about genre references later, but I think also, like, to me, what's also interesting there is that I feel that it kind of fits the time period in a sense of like the 70s and 80s were also a period of time where a lot of women were getting into like physical training, bodybuilding, self-defense lessons, martial arts, and certain specific martial arts, because some of them are more self-defense oriented than others, like out of that need to defend themselves, be independent and all that. But like it's not just the 70s and 80s, it was like since the beginning of like early feminist movements, where back in the 1910s women were learning jiu-jitsu and whatever throughout all feminist movements. That's part of the film that I really liked, the whole like incorporating the physical training and these long scenes there as well.
Hearing you guys speak, I think that it's just sort of summarized for me why I quite liked the approach to using bodybuilding and Jackie being a bodybuilder. Like, I think that there's lots of ways you could go about it that would become quite one-dimensional. Like, you guys have gone over how there's the practical need to defend herself that drives it, but there's also this sort of background about how she explains that she was fat when she was younger and that created insecurity about her body image. And then that kind of ties into what Louisa was saying about how bodybuilding is a sport as well as an aesthetic aim. And I was definitely watching the competition scenes thinking, this just looks identical to any other pageant where they're objectifying and literally judging and critiquing women's bodies. And obviously, like in bodybuilding, it was male dominated, but there was a parallel that just like I don't think I'd quite understood was so similar until watching this film. But I do like that being included as a part of this story, and her character wasn't just a way to be a kind of cheap ploy on like, what if a woman was really muscly? Like it wasn't really just there as shock factor. And also, I think you're right, Reem, it being set in the 80s, it feels like quite a natural thing. And this film in general does a great way of like inserting pop culture references in a way that doesn't feel gimmicky. Like it felt so cohesive, which I really enjoyed. But her being a bodybuilder and being very muscular, and then this being paired with this sort of impulsive violence, obviously that's kind of spurred a bit more on by drug misuse. Like I anticipated a bit of criticism of this film about like monstrosity related to the female body, if it's sort of made grotesque or made, there was a bit of a She-Hulk kind of air to her violence. Obviously there is the steroids being, you know, the sort of pivot in which it becomes very violent. But I don't know, there was parts where I did feel like, oh, maybe this doesn't feel, Louisa used celebratory at the beginning.
Well, I said sexualized in a celebratory way. I would say even when she's being monstrous and there are those like She-Hulk moments, I think she's still fundamentally depicted in a really sexy way.
The tone and the capturing of her muscles and the sound design of like, you could hear her veins popping. It did then like shift me into something that was a little bit more monstrous. Monstrous could be positive. A lot of sexuality within like horror and like that sort of erotica fiction, like monstrosity can be sexy.
Circling back to the connection between her being obsessed with the aesthetics of her body, I think that kind of rings true because like Zeba was saying, a lot of times when people are into bodybuilding, they're so meticulous about their diet and their sleep and everything. And she doesn't really seem to care that much about those things. To her, it's more about how she looks on the outside and how she appears to other people. And also her willingness to take steroids. It was never a question of if she was going to take them. It was just if she could afford them. And when Lou offers them up for free, she's happy to start right away. The steroids in this movie kind of also are like the addiction to like their love and their relationship, even though it's quite toxic from the beginning, because she takes like the first dose while they are having sex, and then she like sees her veins starting to grow and becomes more muscly and bulgy, but it doesn't actually appear to me that she's actually becoming bigger because no one else is like reacting to it. It's as if it's completely in her head that she like feels more powerful because she's obtained someone who like loves her. And as she like does violent acts, like when she kills JJ, she also starts looking like she became physically taller for the first time. And I think it's like the addiction to love and power in this movie are mainly what is she's gaining, but she feels like she's physically gaining. Like even at the bodybuilding competition, when she walks up, if she was as big and muscly as she was in her head, I think people would have been a bit more intimidated, but they don't really seem to pay her much attention at all. She's just kind of there. And I think if she was how she looked in her head, then people would have been really intimidated. There would have been more attention on her, but that wasn't really the case. And she starts to like panic, but also like the addiction between their love starts to be more noticeable in the way that she's absorbing Lou's problems. Like I, at some points, forgot that they had met each other like a week ago because of how entranced they were in each other's problems. Like murdering her brother-in-law, which, yes, JJ was a horrible person and she was valid because he was a abuser, but also like murdering her brother-in-law, killing the girl who witnessed the crimes. Just, like these things aren't normal, or even going to the conclusion of like, we also have to kill your father. This is a really drastic turnaround for a very short-term relationship. So I feel like when she was at the competition and she imagined herself throwing up Lou, it was almost because they start absorbing into each other and becoming the same person.
That's the lesbian urge to merge.
Louisa, if you feel like you're throwing somebody up, I want you to come to us. Get in the group chat
I don't relate to this side of lesbianism, but I did think it was realistic. I believed that they would immediately move in and then sign up to like a life of crime together just because like their short-term partner did something bad and they just don't want to let it go. I think there's a kind of, especially this is 80s and this is a rural town in New Mexico. It's kind of implied that Kristen Stewart is like the dyke of the town. The guy literally calls her the town dyke, I think, something like that.
Apparently Daisy is too, though.
But no, but that's what I mean. Like, I think her only options thus far have really been like Daisy. Like, how many other queer out women are there going to be around? So I feel like this is something that the queer community in general, but lesbians do it this very quickly, is the U-hauling aspect of like an over codependency, because this feeling of like someone understands me and I finally met someone I actually really like, a little needle in a haystack. There's a scarcity mindset with dating. And people settle and they rush into things and they get super intense. And I think this is like a thing that happens quite a lot in queer relationships. I think that kind of immediate codependency, which actually works really well for like a neo-noir thriller of like, right, we're in this together, gotta like get through this. But yeah, I kind of thought, of course this should be queer, because that actually is a context in which I believe they'd get that obsessed with each other and immediately, obviously this is me offering a little bit of the critique of the lesbian culture, with a wink and a nod, because I am in it.
And Kristen Stewart does make that comment about like she's literally never been anywhere else. Like she doesn't even know what options she has out there, and it feels like they are attracted, like deeply attracted to each other at first sight. Like I feel like that to me would be enough. I'd be like, what other life can I have, especially after you're on the lam? Like what other life can you have but with this person? Like that feels like honestly the best option, rather than like stay and elbow deep in a toilet. No, sorry. Go have your sapphic fantasy.
Yeah, I think that was the other thing that I liked about this as well, as a period drama, technically. So again, in an interview with British Vogue, Rose Glass talked about how there's a certain type of tasteful period lesbian drama where all the looking is done very secretly and with longing in a sense of forbiddenness. So I enjoyed here that they're both more horny and blatant. When Lou sees Jackie from across the gym, if I'm referencing anything there, it's the bit in The Mask where Jim Carrey sees Cameron Diaz across the bank. It's fun to lean into the silliness. I think I like that too, because I don't know who, I mean, maybe I said it on the podcast, I don't know, but I'm just very, like, obviously the lesbian period dramas we often get are like 1800s, so it's a different time period where things are more repressed, but it is frustrating that we do get a lot of like longing gazes, and like it's all very soft, slow, and sensual, and I just like that this was like gritty, messy, right to it, like they see each other like, right, we're gonna fuck.
It was like outwardly not just messy, like outwardly disgusting in some parts. A yeast infection waiting to happen. The protein shake down the that was sticky. There was a shot where she's throwing the egg yolks into the trash and it's full of like cigarette butts. Like there's like vomit, there's shit, there's like a lot of really disgusting things happening, like interchange with like very erotic things. And I understand the appeal. I just think that like it is what you're saying, the polar opposite of the like repressed, clean, restrained lesbian period piece where it's like, oh no, this is literally like the refuse. Like you're rolling around in like sweat is one thing and spit is one thing.
It was literally sticky. Like I could feel it.
Reem, you have some, I think you'd have some interesting takes on like, you know, the queer kind of element to this film and the kind of 80s lesbian erotica and the kind of queer references throughout. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, if we go back to all the like the bodybuilding aspects, like one of the reasons why I love the fact that the film featured that kind of, I mean, I almost want to call it a subculture because like back in the late 80s, bodybuilding was an actual thing in lesbian erotica. So there was this erotic magazine called On Our Backs that was kind of a response to like a sex negative zine that was published in the decade before, which was called Off Our Backs. So it was like play on word with that. I remember that in 1988, so it was like 1 year before that film was set in, because it's 1989, they featured poet and bodybuilder Kiri Tsui on the cover of On Our Back. She's a lesbian like model and who also published a lot of lesbian erotica books herself. And like also an interesting part is that I think she won the bronze medal at the Gay Games in 1986. So I looked up the history of bodybuilding and the Gay Games as well, and it's always been there. So like in all gender categories. So I also thought that like bodybuilding has always been like an athletic category in queer sports as well, and that kind of made its way into queer erotica during that time period that the film was set in. Also, so since we're talking about erotica as well, I think you all also noticed like a couple of Easter eggs in the film, which was mainly Patrick Califia's Macho Sluts short stories book that was featured, I think, in 2 scenes. So it's a collection of BDSM infused queer erotica that was also published in '88. I thought it was also interesting for a mainstream film that featured, I mean, I think we're going to unpack and talk about the sex scenes a bit later, but for a film that featured sex scenes in a way that the director said wanted to be a departure from how like clean lesbian period pieces like showed lesbian sexuality. I like the fact that it kind of paid homage to a specific moment in like queer sex history and to some of the more radical predecessors also.
I really liked that you positioned like bodybuilding in queer history as well, because I'm not sure if when I was watching I was really tuned into all of the references that it was kind of like harking back to. I think it did quite an interesting job of those subtle hints of trying to set a location, a time, a place, puts all the sort of like queer sex that we'll get into context in the bodybuilding. And something like that I am curious about, just because you mentioned like erotica and the relationship, I guess, that bodybuilding could have to sexuality developing in those time periods, when she becomes like this sort of giant woman at the very end. I don't know if you guys have seen hints of this online. I'm in a different depths of the internet.
I know what you're
sometimes.
talking about. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Macrophilia, giant woman kink.
Really?
Louisa's like, wow, I found my people. Thank you for letting me know.
No.
I don't think I was like looking, well, during it, especially during that scene, I was kind of like, I wonder how much of this is intentional around like how queer sex, I think, tends to lean towards the kinkier side. It's just that community, because it's also about like challenging very heteronormative ways of having sex. So I was like, how much of this is she sat down and be like, what if we made her a giant woman? Obviously, a lot of that is about like, we were talking about her perception of herself and body image and like these sort of like delusions of grandeur literally kind of being made physical, but also this sort of freedom which is challenged at the very end, but this sense of like a Thelma and Louise freedom of like 2 women running off together. But I also think that some people watching would definitely be aroused by that scene. And even when she put him like between her legs, I thought that was quite an interesting position, that Lou forces the gun into her father's mouth. There's a lot of coding going on here that we talk about a lot, obviously, on the podcast, in terms of like simulated sexual violence. Like, I'm so curious how much of that was intentional.
I assumed it was all intentional. It was as much an erotic film as anything else, and like that, like especially that final scene where she like grows and then presumably shrinks because she gets back in the car. But like everything about that scene felt erotic.
You're like, well, logistically, she had to get small.
Okay, I thought it was gonna be like the end of Grease, where they literally like fly into the sky, and I have to like suspend my disbelief. Yeah, it all felt very intentional in that scene. Each and every shot felt like sexual in some way. Yeah.
It was said in certain outtakes that scene with the father and the gun penetrative mouth in between Jackie's legs was made even more sexual in outtakes, because Kristen Stewart, like, I think made like a thrusting gun motion essentially, but they didn't go with that take. So I think there is like a definite, erotic undertone at play, somewhat Freudian. I think this is where we get our monstrous feminine like stuff interjected, I think, in that kind of final father-daughter showdown. The idea, like Reem, you mentioned earlier, is like Jackie is a kind of vigilante killer, is like Barbara Creed's femme castratrice character, only I guess it's fundamentally, you've talked about why it's like kind of recap that again. And then Ty, you alluded to that kind of vomiting monstrous birth scene. But you mentioned it being like love being cannibalizing or something like that. And I completely agree. I do think it is their kind of codependency. And Rose Glass says something interesting in the Dazed interview. So she actually co-wrote this, is interesting to note, with director of Baby Reindeer, Veronica Tolfilska. And she says, Veronica and I were very much railing against the idea that female characters are expected to be morally righteous and make people feel comfortable. Lou and Jackie have this monstrous rage that turns each other on, and their love for each other is extreme and all over the place. One second they're fighting in the streets, and another they're embracing each other. I'm interested in seeing women making terrible decisions and really making a mess of things. When Jackie throws up and gives birth to Lou in this dreamlike sequence, we were thinking of how lovers consume each other in this kind of dependent relationship. When Vera and I were writing it, the idea was of a Pygmalion kind of thing where one woman creates the other and then controls her, and then it all gets out of hand. We are not trying to let them off the hook easily for this insane love. And then the giant scene, again, Rose Glass had something to say in that same interview where she talks about how they wanted to go into a really dreamlike territory, and they played around with like a more kind of realistic ending, but they said that this just felt like the most natural conclusion. She said it was either like, quote, it's either total annihilation or she turns into a giant. And of course, it's that feeling of their love, which seems invincible and larger than life.
Yeah, Mila totally thought the same thing about when she became colossal. Low-key is like also fitting along with like Poor Things and Lisa Frankenstein of like creating your partner. Because Jackie, when she's like juiced up and she turns into like this sort of kill machine who fights Lou's battles, she's like very out of it. Like at one point she even like hits Lou, and she doesn't really have her like normal sort of cognitive functions. And even when she's like very, very massive at the end with Lou's father, she's not like talking to her. It feels like she's almost like a Frankenstein sort of creature where she like goes in and out, and that Lou is like the person who is controlling this beast version of herself. So it kind of like had echoes to like a Frankensteinian romance in a way to me, because of how she has the two sides of her, and one of them is kind of a beast, and then the other one is like her normal playful self. Because I feel like Jackie has this childlike wonder of like, oh, we're gonna go to California, I'm gonna be a trainer. Like, she doesn't really like live in the real world. She's just doing whatever. Literally like met Lou and was like, I was wondering if I can like live at your house after meeting someone after a day. She's like very spontaneous and childlike and wondrous. But like the primal version of her that comes out when she's like juiced up and ready to fight is like knows nothing but violence. And she has it at the weightlifting competition, she has it when she kills. But in every single one of those scenarios is connected to Lou, because she, even at the weightlifting competition, is after she visualizes herself throwing up Lou. Maybe she also feels like a sense of betrayal since she left Lou there to deal with the murder that she committed. But yeah, it kind of like echoed that sort of Frankensteinian theme that I think we've seen in like quite a few films recently.
I wanted to go back to more about their codependency, like, because I think their relationship starts because Lou likes her because maybe on a subconscious level she likes to feel safe and protected, and it becomes like against domestic abuse, and then almost the violence gets introduced into their own relationship, as you just mentioned, Tyia. And I thought it was just interesting when we consider that kind of cyclical nature. I mean, this is a film that very much links sex and violence together in a way that horror, we talk about horror and body horror doing quite frequently, but this is in more of a thriller context. So Wendy Ide for The Guardian said that, I suspect, I'm quoting here, I suspect that Glass intends Beth and JJ to be more than just the dramatic device that unleashes the film's dark heart and violent impulses. They also serve as a kind of twisted mirror image of Lou and Jackie's armor fou, and a cautionary warning that any relationship this thoroughly soaked in blood can't ultimately end well, however invincible the partnership and the passion that drives it might seem at the time. And another critic, Brian Tallarico for Roger Ebert website, said he noted that Lou's not a victim and that she's the cleaner, And this film highlights how acts of violence have a very practical aftermath that someone has to clean up. And I thought, kind of linking these, it is interesting that in the kind of psychology of it, in trying to like escape a life of violence, like Lou, in a kind of almost Freudian way, and then we come back to the end where she kind of gun fucks her dad's mouth. I don't know how else to phrase this, but it is a kind of like weird daddy issues subtext of, you know, she didn't talk to her father. She was estranged from him because he involved her in her life of crime, and then somehow comes back completely full circle in like a kind of almost codependent relationship where, again, at the very end, we see this in particular. She kills Daisy. She's now committing murder again. A life of violence she tried to escape with her father, she just gets wrapped up into with her partner. Low-key, she instigates with the steroids and the drugs. So I'm not trying to say she's completely innocent party. Like, she's a catalyst for this for sure. And her cleaning of it is enabling it. But yeah, I just think there is like a kind of Freudian full circle cyclical dynamic to their relationship and what feels so codependent. And that's what I really like about it. And I really like the monstrous birth scene, vomit scene, as a way of illustrating that.
I feel like that's so right about like the addition of these sort of family affairs underpinning, like it's promoted as like something that's focusing in on a relationship and love. But I think it's so important to have this like unhinged, toxic family drama that really grounds Lou. And I mean, it's something we see a lot in horror because it's sort of the killer or the killer's motives are kind of determined, enacted by normally a mother figure. So there's a lot of sort of like Freudian undertones we see. It's nice in a thriller to see, because we did Rose Glass before on the podcast with St. Maud. Like, I think that she has a great understanding of both genres. And so to see her obviously apply so much intentionality to a thriller, a queer relationship, and then having this sort of underpinning of daddy issues, essentially, and combining that with all this sort of body horror, sexuality, kinky kind of subtext. I think that where we haven't seen that work so well in other films, where either because it was just wrapped up in a lot of the like recycled imagery of horror that is like inadvertently kind of Freudian or, you know, monstrous feminine. Here it feels like so wrapped up, and that could be super boring. Like that could be so like it's a dead end of just like no further analysis needed. But actually, like, I think it does really well splicing together really complex imagery and like theory in a sense that also doesn't feel preachy or like art house, or do you know what I mean? It just kind of worked together so well. And I think that's like hugely impressive to pull off, because I think like this film stylistically for me was pretty perfect. Like I think it was so beautifully stitched together. The choreography of actors, like I think it was just so like wonderfully done. But this film, like you said, like having the family drama be quite cyclical with Lou trying so hard not to become her father, but at the end like just is, I think is such a nice tie-in. I think it does elevate if this was just a love story in essence.
I think like what made me realize that Lou kind of thought she was further away from her generational curses, quote unquote, than she was is when her dad says like in the car to Jackie that he owns the gym that she works at. And then I was like, well, if she works at her dad's gym, then she's not really that far away from him. He's still technically controlling her. It's more so in her mind. So I think in Lou's mind, she's very far away from the violence in her family, and she's very far away from everything they have going on. But in actuality is like embedded into her everyday life. And she's still working for him, giving him money. She's willing to put her hand in a toilet to unclog it instead of just like letting his gym go to shit. And she meets Jackie in that same context, and their relationship becomes clouded by that same sort of violence and her dad's influence and the toxicity that he brings, which she inadvertently brings onto Jackie by giving her the steroids. So it's kind of like the way that that cycle plays out is quite interesting, because you just keep getting like more and more layers to it throughout the film, which I thought was really cool. And also, I think Rose Glass does something really interesting in both this and Saint Maud, where you have a very big build-up scene towards the end of the movie where the main character's body gives way to like them reaching some sort of oasis or like paradise, because in Saint Maud she sets herself on fire and she's imagining that she's like turning into this angel, but in every actuality everyone is horrified as she's like flaming on the beach. And then in this one, Jackie is imagining herself to reach like this giant level and able to protect Lou, but as Zeba said, she's in the car at the end, so we know that that probably didn't happen that way. And the like purple and pink light that they're running off into probably was more like them running past some police cars. So it's like them using their body to, and they're also like create a false image in their mind is really interesting. And I'm wondering if she'll have this pattern in some of her other films.
I want to circle back to 80s music, because one thing this film got me doing is dancing. I have been playing 80s synth pop. Like, I absolutely was living for it. And I think it added to the film feeling really fun, even though it was also tense and thrilling, dare I say.
Yeah, well, I think that goes into the whole like queer history and like hunting for queer Easter eggs in the movie, because I felt that the gayest part of the film for me was the score and the soundtrack. Going into the movie, seeing the whole like 80s neon Americana thing, I was kind of worried that they choose like 80s songs that everybody knew and that the crowd was gonna sing along to, or I was just worried it was gonna go into the like 80s nostalgia core route. And I was really happy that it musically it went into like the synth rock, synth pop route, because it's like when you look into the history of music, that's like the climax of 80s gender fuckery in terms of like musical style, but also like the visual aspects as well that the musicians played around with, and like stylistically and with clothing and stuff. So like the list is endless, but I did pick out like 3 titles that I would love our listeners to go listen to on YouTube or Spotify or wherever. But first, like when Lou and Jackie first meet at the gym, we can listen over the radio Transformation by Nona Hendrix. So that was like a first cue that I was really thrilled with. Shortly after Jackie's first steroids injection and when the first the first sex scene, they fucked Patrick Cowley's Mutant Man. So Cowley was a pioneer of like the high energy sound in the late 70s, early 80s. And he also went on to score a bunch of gay porn films. So love the fact that the first sex scene was to that track. And also when Jackie is exercising in the gym, I could recognize Gina X Performance song called Nice Mover. And the lyrics go something like, I'm a transformer. Call me Marlene. Call me Gino. That's me, you know. So you also have that whole like physical transformation, aspect that you find in a lot of the songs that were picked out for the film. That is like something that I really loved about it, and I think I read somewhere that Rose Glass really worked with a music consultant on the choice of tracks for the film.
That makes sense. It did give like circuit party, but also like I don't know. These are also like sites of like the gym. That's exactly where gay sex happens.
I loved the like all the motivational, which also then hint to the plot where it's like pain is gain. I don't know exactly what they said, but it's like pain's a weakness and you can overcome it and all this other shit. I loved the idea of somehow tying, I mean, I don't love this, but you know what I mean? In terms of imagery, I thought it's an interesting device to like link these inspirational workout mottos to how toxic and like how love and violence and sex and love and sex and death are like sides of the same coin. I thought that was like such an interesting like tie-in with this visual imagery. I think they did a really good job with just like costume and creating like an immersive 80s setting. And also apparently, and I learned this from an AP interview on YouTube with Kristen Stewart, Katie O'Brien, and Rose Glass. Katie O'Brien revealed that the equipment that they used was also from the 80s. And she was like, and like women weren't like working out like that. So all of them are designed for men. And so you have to like adjust your height in order to like hit the right muscles. And Katie O'Brien actually was a real life bodybuilder. And I thought, like, I think it would make sense. Like, I think you'd have to have somebody who's in this, like as you called it, assault culture, Reem, in order to portray it actively. Because Katie spoke in another interview for British Vogue, speaks about, like, how there is an obsessive relationship with food in that kind of culture. And, like, you have to, she says you have your counting and you're weighing yourself and you're counting calories. And you can't enjoy meals with your friends. And she says, she quoted in this interview, "I'm a live by moderation type of person, but I know a lot of people who had liver or kidney failure, like from this like situation." And I don't think I know enough about bodybuilding to speak to it too much, but from the outside looking in, I think it does obviously have like some very toxic elements, which this film is touching on and which Katie can speak to. And in another interview that she gave with the Barbell, she says that she quit because she was doing it in 2014 and 2015, but she quit ultimately because she wasn't willing to do steroids. So I think it's interesting that she then sent him to this film where, I mean, that's the whole plot, is that she gets roid rage, which, by the way, I did not know. I did not know that Luca gets high from steroids. Is that part of like a surrealist element to this, or is that real? I know you can get anger. I know that like obviously that aggression's a side effect, but were they just kind of like making her high? Is that like part of the surrealist plot, or does anyone know more about steroids? I don't know.
I'm a little bit familiar with bodybuilding. I've gone on some bodybuilding deep dives actually, but less so more than I am working on a book. If anybody doesn't know, I edit books for my living. I'm working on a book now about pro wrestling culture in like rural Georgia, and the author is a journalist, so she's doing all these interviews, and she has a lot of scenes about like it's mostly men. Obviously there's like women pro wrestlers and things like that, but it's the same thing. Like wrestling is aesthetics. It's about looking big. You should be strong enough to like execute the moves, but considering that it's mostly theater and arguably drag, a lot of it is it's about like looking like the big strong guy, and they have to eat in very particular ways, and she has exactly these same moments in her book about the posters on the walls having those like motivational quote unquote, but they're really just like a lot of them are quite aggressive, like the messaging that these like men in particular give each other, policing each other's bodies. There's like a father-son duo where he's like, if he's just under 200, I call him a skinny bitch. If he's just over 200, I call him a fat bitch. Like this is really like it's a part of gym culture, but even more so in bodybuilding and wrestling, where you just want to like look a particular way, and they get, they spray tan, they do all that fun stuff. The costumes are meant to exaggerate particular muscles. I thought those itty bitty bikinis that she was wearing in her performance, I was like, girl, that's gonna cover like maybe an areola. Like it's also like camp that this is basically just like a pasty and a thong, and like you might as well just be naked up there. But you're right, tied into like the toxic like diet culture. I think she just was a little bit like footloose and fancy free. Like, yes, she's only going to eat the egg whites, but ultimately she was like wreaking havoc on her body. And I think that like it's not a healthy sport in the same way that like wrestling, people get like, you do it for the theatricality. Like it's not for like the glory of having the strongest body. It's about like the audience. It's about being perceived. So like, and I think in her mind, when she's like, okay, I understand that we are on the lam, but I gotta go to Vegas. She's like, you can stay here, I'm gonna go. It's because that's all she's worked for. Like she has nothing else that she's even alive for besides like this relationship and getting to be seen, right? Like it's not even like enough for her that her body has reached a point where she is satisfied with it. Everybody has to like view it. It's also about the audience factor and I want to call it theatricality, I want to call it aesthetics, but there's something more than that. Like we could even call it like a gaze. Like we don't even see the audience, and that she's so out of it. She's so like high on whatever that she doesn't even really perceive or hear the audience. We just kind of know they're there. They're almost like blurred out shadow figures. So it's interesting to me that like this is actually quite an insular world for a sport that is all about audience reaction and like judges' perception of your body and eyes on your body. So I wondered if anybody had any thoughts about that. But then almost relatedly, it feels like a kind of sadomasochism to put your body through that much pain. And then also there's like sadomasochism as a part of their sexual relationship. There's at one point where she like bites her toe really hard, or she like punches her. Like there's violence as a part of their like sexual life as well. And I didn't know, I could not, I think I need to sit with it longer, but I wondered if anybody had any thoughts about like enacting violence on the body, one in the sense of like working out, eating the drugs as a form of like almost like self-harm, but like she's getting off on it, she loves how she looks, And then there's the elements of like pain and pleasure in their sexual life. They felt related to me, but I couldn't form the bridge in my mind.
You've kind of guided me to like scattered thoughts I was having about the same thing. So I have seen an interview with Arnold Schwarzenegger about his bodybuilding days, and he compares like getting ripped to coming. So there's a really interesting connection, I think, to the idea of building your body to this sort of, I mean, it's obviously like grounded in these like ideals of masculinity and testosterone. You're right, like Zeba, what you said, you mentioned just about this sort of having an essence of drag to it. Absolutely. Like these exaggerated gender performances. There's a lot of complex kind of gender politics at play in the film, because we obviously have that connection between, like you guys have all pointed out, between like violence and sex in the film. And then we also have like bodybuilding and strength and also steroid use. But then there's also like the eroticism of her body. Like it gets really kind of complicated because, especially I think like an audience today, I don't think this wouldn't be in the sort of like cultural subconscious at the time of the 80s, but like nowadays audiences are very tuned in to like a lot more about the trans community and like questioning a lot of like the mainstream audience's ideas of like biological body versus gender. I think just the idea of seeing a muscly woman today, I think would, for a lot of like mainstream audiences, kind of be wrapped up in like the trans debate that's going on. Obviously a lot of that, especially in the UK, is like basically attacks on the trans community, but like people are kind of tuned into it a lot more.
This matches right up with the trans people in sports debate, like about folks taking testosterone, or intersex people who participate on sports at a really high level, like Caster Semenya. Like that shit was like, people could not be at peace with that situation. And I feel like, you know, let's say somebody was taking hormones to, you know, as a gender affirming care, and then is also a bodybuilder, is also a, you know, an athlete in some way. Like, I'm surprised I haven't seen no op-eds in that direction about this film.
That's so true. But also I liked what you said about the sort of like the pain also of like achieving these aesthetic goals and bodybuilding and like this kind of self-torture. Like we see it in St. Maud as well, like because of the religious context of that film, this sort of like self-flagellation. That is actually something that's so prevalent in just even beauty standards. Like think about the pain we enact on ourselves to reach like gender ideals. But I think that unfortunately like the queer community also falls into those trappings.
For a lot of men, it's about like feeling like the most masculine person in the room, and it is them trying to achieve their gender goals. And when they lose, they're like, well, fuck, I might as well be a woman now. Take a hit to their ego.
I think that brings us back to what Reem was saying about like, and what you were saying actually about bodybuilding. Then what does it mean for, or why was Jackie so motivated by it? It was to get strong. It was a protective thing.
Motivated also by this sort of like childhood trauma. I think that in a way that could have felt very like too cliche in this society where like so fucking fat phobic. I think that something that seemingly trivial as just being a bit overweight when you were younger, like can completely alter someone's life and perception of themselves way into adulthood.
She said something about like beating up bullies. Like not only was she like not perceived as fat anymore, but she could also like defend herself.
I feel like I want to see this and then a screening of like Black Swan as like opposite ends of gendered like competitive sports that wreak havoc on your body.
I mean, they both have very irrational anger towards like she's really angry and she won't hear Lou out about why she slept with Daisy. And obviously, like if Lou wanted to sleep with Daisy, she could have done it a while ago. She definitely witnessed you guys disposing of a body, but they just like their anger and their possessiveness is very much like one side of the toxicness in the relationship. But going back to what you guys were saying about the diet and her obsession with exercising, to me this movie feels like heavily about addiction, and the exercising is like one part of it, and how she is going through like all of this pain and she's not happy while she's doing the exercising, but she feels euphoric when she reaches her goals. Every time she reaches a new one, whether it's killing someone and able to like prove to herself that she can defeat a man, she's bigger, whether it's when she gets to the bodybuilding competition, like her veins are like pulsing because she recently juiced up just before she got there. It's proving something to herself. And we obviously also have like the obvious physical use of a drug to enhancement drug to make her get bigger, alongside that addiction to the exercising and the euphoria that she's getting from watching her body transform. There's also the addiction in their relationship, and it's very obvious, I would say early on, that it's not great for either of them and that they're putting themselves through something that's very damaging and almost traumatic in ways, just by the way that they are going through like such intense traumatic times, and their emotions are never regulated throughout the film. But then even when they have these fights, there's usually a quick succession of a sex scene, which is like showing how they're basically patching up all of the problems in their relationship with their intense physical connection, which can sometimes also get into violence. Like she's like addicted to these physical highs and lows, and she keeps chasing them at the expense of her body and her mental stability throughout the film. And at the end, there's not like a sense that like they're going off to the sunset to be happy. Like they're disposing of another body.
But they're going to be happy after that, Tyia, just as soon as the other body is taken care of.
The fact that Daisy was alive gave them the chance to sort of change the course of how their relationship was going.
Nah, she had to take her out. I'm sorry.
She was the town annoying person. Nobody even acknowledged that girl was missing. But like, it's just a continuous cycle that they're like both going to continue. We don't have any indication that Jackie is going to stop taking steroids. She's still very much interested in getting bigger, making those gains, as the fitness bros who only eat chicken breasts and white rice say. But yeah, it's like like a cycle of addiction is like so prevalent in this film. And I also think it's an interesting commentary because I do think there are so many people who actually are addicted to like fitness gains, like the people who are afraid to drink flavored things on TikTok, or like those fitness bros who don't use salt and pepper on chicken because they think it has calories. Please, like that is not normal and it's not healthy.
Did you guys see that like screen grab that did the rounds on Tumblr where it was basically, I don't know who it was, but somebody saying that love is like a neurochemical con job? And this film does give like a little, it's giving that a little bit, like the sort of, I don't know, parallels between like Ty, you just said, addiction and like substance abuse and feeling affection and love and acceptance, like gets wrapped up in a lot of, addictive kind of behaviors.
You were talking about Jackie being presented as bisexual, because I think there's something there that's pretty interesting because, like, again, whenever I'm watching a lot of these genre bending films, I like to place them in like a constellation of previous references of queer films and genre films I've seen. And that like figure of the, like, first of all, there are a lot of like film noir references in this film that we're maybe gonna get into at one point, but I felt that, like in a lot of noir films, you have that figure of the femme fatale that comes in and completely changes the course of the life of the main character, who's like this loner that's wasting away in their small town and whatever. And Jackie was like a spin on that because she did not fit the femme fatale type. But the one thing they kept from that is that she was bisexual, or at least like ambivalent in terms of her sexuality. Like that was the one thing that they kept, which I thought was interesting. And also when I place it in reference to a lot of these sexploitation films where women are dominating men in single combat, and like these ripped women, like my personal favorite, Faster Pussycat Kill Kill. There are also a lot of these athletic girls, like that's what I think the archetype for that type of character was. A lot of them are also presented as bisexual. And as, like, in a lot of these sexploitation scenes, you also had them having sex with men for, like, the male gaze part, and then having sex with women, but with a different gaze, not necessarily completely geared towards a male gaze. So I thought that, I don't know, that detail about Jackie's sexuality, I think, was also quite interesting and relevant in terms of references it makes to film history as well, and that archetype
I like this film in the sense of actually giving more morally complex, especially queer characters. I feel like we get a lot of really sanitized depictions, and it's often also because of the genre. Like if we're in like a different, more like Hallmarky kind of setting, we're not going to really get too much into people saying incorrect things. But I also just like a more realistic depiction. Like, you know, people say stupid shit all the time in the queer community, and art can be turfy, can be biphobic, and I mean, it's a passing comment, and it's partly said out of anger, but also, yeah, I think it's better to have realistic characters, and it's something that Kristen Stewart comments on why she was attracted to the role in an interview with Empire. She says that we are constantly watching movies about women triumphing over oppressive forces because we're somehow ethically or morally superior, says Stewart. Sick of that. I'm so sick of that fucking movie. And this one just felt so like we were allowed to pull our dress over our head and run down the street and use the boys' toys and shove them in their faces, and then also be like, we're nothing like you. But yeah, I kind of like that element of it. I liked that they were not sound. I like that they're kind of like terrible people, is essentially what I'm getting at. I think that's more interesting to watch. And I think there's a place for like a kind of more sanitized depiction of queer characters, of course. But I just ultimately have gotten in recent years really, really bored with even like Netflix shows or whatever, where it's like I feel like I'm just getting the same mouthpiece queer character who says everything right and seems more like trying to do like really perfect representation or something. It's like the good queer or something, I guess, whatever. And I'm kind of like, oh, I'm really bored of that now. And I think I like that this film goes beyond that and just shows like not just the biphobic comment, but I mean like in general with their actions, like they are not good people. And yeah, I like that.
No, I completely like felt the same thing as you, Louisa, watching this film. Like liking the fact that all the characters were completely like shitty to each other and terrible and all over. And it kind of made me think about a debate that's been going on for a few years about, you know, seeking positive queer representation. Because like I think 5 years ago the whole debate was, oh, when I grew up it was all these Disney movies where the queer coded characters were the villains and I didn't get like a positive happy ending, blah blah blah. And I was like, I kind of loved that villain era though, and like that is my favorite part ever of like queer media representation or whatever you want to call it. And I kind of felt that we've hit a point where the like positive representation thing is a dead end, and I'm happy that we're at a point where in like more mainstream productions you can have that like super like messy, terrible characters, and no one's gonna come out and be like, oh, but I like it's not a figure that you want to look up to and it's not fully sanitized. And I understand that also at a time a strategy for the queer community was to play like respectability politics and stuff and want to like sanitize everything, but I'm kind of happy we're beyond that. It feels way more liberating as well.
The way this movie was received was really interesting. Like, I think a lot of people had a really great time. But then it reanimated this debate that like is age old, going back to like the debate that was happening over macho sluts is very similar to the debate that people have over this movie about like people feeling like, you know, they had a similar body type and they felt over sexualized, or like they felt like they were wielding like the eroticism of it in a way that wasn't responsible, or like da 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 da. And like I don't agree with those takes, but I think it's really interesting that they even are happening, that we're even like having this debate about it when the movie is referring to the debate that we've already had before. So I agree with you that like I love that we're in a place where like I feel like we've gotten through the Hallmark happy endings. Like y'all, we've like there's enough. If you want a queer representation that's like easy and mimics a heteronormative structure and like can be a rom-com or something like that, I'm glad that we have those. But it's not that it's disappointing to me that we're still having these debates about like whether or not it's like wrong or right to depict eroticism in these ways. It's just like whoa, we need to return to the text, like myself included. Like we all need to realize like what debates are like well-trodden ground at this point. And like the sex negativity that is happening in this moment, I understand it because the internet has done like a really crazy number on everybody, and like we can be exploited in new and innovative ways. But I am absolutely seeing more sex negativity now in my adult life than I did as like a young queer adolescent on the come up. I don't know, something has shifted in the past like decade or so. And like for the most part, I think the people who saw this movie in theaters, because it's like relatively new, like are people who really wanted to see this type of sexuality depicted. But I think once it gets on streaming, we're going to see a lot of backlash. Like once people don't have to pay for it anymore, and the people who weren't already interested in this type of eroticism get easier access to it, I won't be surprised if we have this like sex negative conversation surrounding it in the next couple of months, which might be when this episode comes out.
Bone or killjoy, you know what I mean? Like just bring, what did you say, Mila? Bring sex back.
Responsibly, though.
Yeah, responsibly. But I mean, like, I kind of want to see things be, I think Rose Glass has a responsible handling on the situation. I would trust her to do this and explore this.
Not commenting on this movie in particular, but I think with Hollywood in general and film industries, sex scenes definitely need to be on safe sets, because that is not always the case. So it's hard to advocate for that, because I think part of like the pushback in the past couple of years has been like, because I would say like online culture has become almost like Puritan-y, with so many people being trad wifey and like very sex negative and saying they want to get married younger and they don't want to work, and it's just been like a weird return to like straight up 1950s values. So I'm not super shocked that that has all gone along with like being more sex negative.
The Me Too movement has obviously done so much in terms of like bringing awareness to the layers and layers of exploitation in the film industry. But I think that unfortunately, in general, like this idea of representation became kind of the be all end all of, we will fix this like societal illness by creating these really packaged, sanitized examples of representation. And it just ended up being like this weird, you mentioned it being sort of puritanical and kind of witch hunty. And Gen Z enact this on each other. Like you see it with any sort of political context right now. Their idea of activism is very much call outs. It also creates this like culture in which there's no room for nuance, for like any sort of critical analysis. With sex, for example, they have written off, you know, all on-screen sex as inherently exploitative and bad. And I think that what I like about this film is that we talked about the ways in which the film's like stylistically it's a slick thriller, the pace, the editing, everything's very like, you know, smooth and seamless, but the characters are very messy. Their queerness and their sort of relationship to each other is messy because it's a realistic depiction of two people with both seemingly troubled pasts, like that's putting it lightly, can come together and try to have some kind of relationship. I think that it is so much more, it's not just effective, because films are not meant to, you know, that function is not just to have some kind of meaning, moral message effect that you take away from it, but it's more that it's just like, oh yeah, this is what it's like to actually just enjoy a film and not have to be sitting there and like sieving through your brain
into making
about like
this because they have a giant woman fetish.
Which, don't get me wrong, of course, like so much of cinema is basically just like pornographic imagery. Like I'm not saying that those things aren't true and that we shouldn't be considerate. Like Tyia said, that bringing sex back has to come with like a really radical sort of reimagining of how not just sex is depicted, but also like practically how it's filmed, and making sure that's like why intimacy coordinators are such a great addition to the industry. But it is like Reem was saying, like Zeba was saying, everyone was saying, that having only sanitized versions of representation, it's not only fucking boring, but it's also just serving the suits who are just trying to make the most money, recycled trends of like, okay, the thing that people respond well to and that we don't get in trouble for is like these really fucking bland characters who just check a box. It's like a fucking corporate diversity quota. And that's so depressing. And that's what I think created so much of these like very bland, stale, sanitized depictions of not just like, we can obviously expand beyond just a queer community, but like queer sex and queer love. And it does, yeah. I mean, we grew up in a time where it was like, all those sort of sex comedies like American Pie, and like our relationship to sex in films is so different to like Gen Z. But I'm glad, like you said, Reem, that I think it's coming around. Like it goes in waves, obviously, but I think there's going to be a resurgence of media that's not just serving that function of like diversity quotas that appease the heads at Netflix.
No, I definitely got what you were saying. I think like what this movie does well is like I know that like BFI had a segment and it's like been a slogan around for like decades of like be gay, do crime. And I think this movie was like it was fun. And the idea like that things have to be like so sanitized is annoying to me because then when you have those sort of things like Heartstopper, people still find fault within them. It's like nothing is going to be the perfect representation of queerness or like in general, just like the same sense of like no one's going to be happy 100% with something. But I feel like that sort of like over critique is just something that's very prevalent in like communities of like people of color, of queer communities where like everyone wants to dissect things because I think identities become like very niche. Like everyone has like their own thing, but also like craving representation. And so you're so hard on things when they do come out because it's hard for everyone to feel represented by it. And I mean, on one hand, it's because like there isn't a lot of queer media, just as like there isn't enough Black media or enough Asian media or enough Latin media. It's just, and there's so many like representations on how to like be white on camera or like white identity or whatever. But I think like by being over critiquing, like that's one reason why Netflix gets to get away with canceling literally any show with lesbians in it, with the exception of Heartstopper, is because like they're like, oh, people didn't like it, or like, oh, it was heavily critiqued. And I remember when like First Kill came out, and there were people saying like that show was too like sexually explicit for teens, and I was like, they didn't show anything. Like, there's no nudity. Like, are you just freaked out by seeing girls kissing? Like, what the fuck? What I do like about this film is like they feel like a couple, because I've noticed like in American media when we have couples in movies, like they do not kiss or touch or like have sex in a way that feels normal. Like everything is so like scene, and they don't just like show little acts of affection throughout like them walking by. They won't like rub a shoulder or like kiss someone or like kiss in a way that's natural, which is I think like one of the reasons why I've really started to like international cinema more, because I feel like that's so much more like ingrained in the media. But in this film, I feel like they did that really well, where they felt very natural and like a couple. And I think like that sort of interweaving makes a lot more sense than having like a 15-minute drawn out sex scene in a movie and then like it's radical because it's a queer sex scene. I'm like, I think just showing this to me felt like more radical because it was just like the monotony of, I guess, a relationship, but also like they have different sorts of sex scenes, like where they're the first one where they're like more excited and getting to know each other and it's more like da 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 whatever. They have ones that are more passionate and that felt more normal. This weird commodifying of like, here's the one singular sex scene that a couple who's in love had. Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, in the grand scheme of a movie, especially when you have a relationship as addictive as theirs, it made more sense. And I know there's like a film called Duck Butter that's like a couple over 24 hours or something, like have sex every hour. And that film also was sort of edging on this, but like they timed it by the hour. So also it was like very much insane. I agree with you about like the Puritan thing has to stop, and their sex in films are normal, but also like I would just want them to feel normal and not like insane.
The burden of representation and having to contend with like bad or no queer representation that came before is I just think people should just focus on what the story currently is for whatever it is narrative that you're telling, and just focus on trying to make that good, and whatever you do with that, be it as it may, like just write interesting characters and interesting stories and let the pieces fall. Like I personally, like if you have to kill off a character, then you have to kill off a character. Like it's not, I think we're not supposed to be aware of tropes for the sake of never again like having bury your gays or something like that. It's more of like being aware of the canon so that you know where representation is lacking, or you know how better or more responsibly to depict things. Do you know what I mean? I think like that's more what I would hope would come from an awareness of previous representation. And I think like I think about this a lot in comparison to the old L word generation and then the new L reboot that they made, in the sense that like Bette Porter's character in the OG is like, you know, she's kind of abusive and she's a cheater and she's not a good person really. She's also like, you know, people find her hot and iconic and like a cult little favorite of like that previous viewing. But the first L Word is like littered with like problematic things. And then I watched the reboot because I was interested in the L Word. And I remember thinking just like how they don't feel like real characters at all. I think in like in a focus to like try to bring things up, like it obviously is nice to, I mean, I guess they did have a trans character in the form of Max in the original actually, but I just mean like in the sense of like trying to do better representation. In some ways they did do better representation. I just felt like we lost something that was kind of real, and there wasn't like a focus on them seeming kind of interesting as characters really, beyond the fact that they were like identity tick boxes. It felt like in their casting, no offense to the actors, but I'm more thinking about like how we're thinking about making queer content. I think it like kind of sometimes shows in like what we're making, whereas the L Word went on to have like 7 seasons and like, you know, quite in a different time, which I think is quite radical. And I'm not saying like I want representation to be as problematic as that, but like I'm just saying that there's something compelling about characters that we've lost in trying to make them be perfect, and that's not what we should be doing. I think it's like just have an awareness of that when you're making art, but just focus on whatever the character is, and if they're a bad person, they're a bad person. Like I don't know. Anyway, that's just my little rant.
We've talked about the issues of just like, yeah, the characters become stale when your priority is just to create mouthpieces for whatever sort of cultural wars are going on at the time. But it's a lot more insidious when we are relying so much on media representation to humanize communities within the sort of power dynamic of the media industry. Ultimately, it's not going to work. The motivations of whoever's funding these sort of like, you know, TV shows or films is profit, no fucking shit. But it's also about like feeding this kind of general culture of like critiquing something on the basis of like morality checkboxes over, like you said, storytelling and good. I mean, good and bad art is not the conversation here. It's more about like, what does media really do in society? I mean, obviously, so many negative things in terms of being like channels for propaganda, but we can't let it become, even if it's good propaganda, like it can't do that either, because it's basically relying on it's relying on a vehicle controlled by still the like, you know, the most powerful people in society.
Representation is just one facet of change making, and representation alone, like good representation, bad, is not going to save us. I think we focus, and I think people have allowed themselves to be conned into thinking about representation as the be all and end all, because it ironically is the most passive form of political engagement, in the sense that you're right, it's like you're you know, what you watch and what you consume. But it's not, like you said, like Tyia, you made a point about production. Like we need to focus a lot on that, and the power, like who's making is more important than what's being depicted. Representation is not the be all and end all of how to change things. Sorry, I don't want to deny the power of bad representation and propaganda, but I just mean to say it's not good representation isn't the be all and end all.
When I think back to like the shows that I grew up watching, probably not for the best, like True Blood was like very messy, and it had its moments of like where different characters were like quote unquote problematic or whatever, and the show was like very explicit, but it was like, and I'm like, also it's a vampire show, like it's gonna be camp, it's gonna be horny, like that's normal. I feel like if that was made now, it would be so much more sanitized. And I feel like we're going through like another Hays Code kind of period in which people are like trying to restrict media in a way that is almost bizarre for where we are in this time. I feel like in a way society is somehow like where it's at its most progressive and like most conservative at the same time in recent years. And it's like the cross between those things is crazy, because you have people on one side who are very like open and want to see certain things and like very accepting of other identities and cultures, but also on that same side there are people who are like very much unable to see nuance. I just feel like in general, like there's such a black and white way that people view everything that it's kind of like a problem with media literacy, one, because I think younger generations just didn't really grow up decoding media in the same way. They just kind of had things given to them. They were exposed to media far younger. this is the iPad kids at this point. Like, they just didn't really grow up with media the same way.
Interesting what Ty you said about it becoming like the Hays Code has kind of come back, but like it's being policed instead by us. I think us, like as in just young people in general. And also what Reem you said about how like that gay villain trope resonated with you so much more than like any of the good, you know, quote unquote representation now. And it's interesting because like they say like all of those sort of like queer coded villains came about because the Hays Code, one of them was basically you can't depict homosexuality, and so like all of these camp villains just appeared without any sort of explicit, you know, depictions of being gay. And I feel like we're kind of in that period now, but we're not getting any good like, okay, that's maybe unfair. Like there's so much like radical filmmaking that goes on in the underground, like as it always does. It's just I really want to drag that not necessarily into the mainstream because that's not changing anything so much. Like we need a kind of like system reboot in general, but it's like there needs to be some kind of radicalization coming out of all of this like puritanical sanitization.
I think it's coming. I sense it coming. I do see the spectrum is just widening. Like people's response, like they're swinging right, and they have these like weird conservative views that they think are progressive. But on the same side, I do see a lot of art speaking back to that. Like even though it is flawed, I think sex is coming back in a big way in media. I think there'll be some like stumbling points and like some stuff that we don't love, but I think ultimately like people are speaking back to this sort of like weird conservative turn that art is taking, and I'm optimistic about it.
My only really, I think we've done a lot here, but my only other last point was just about this negative review I saw that I wanted us to talk about, and it was from Richard Brody for the New Yorker this year, 2024. The overarching comment is like a comment on a really poor characterization. I'm going to just kind of read, and it's kind of wordy, but whatever. First of all, it talks about Love Lies Bleeding is a period piece set in 1989, ... Yet Lou and Jackie have nothing to say about the events of their time and show little interest in the wider world. Point one. In this regard, and then he goes on to say, Love Lies Bleeding is very much a movie of the current moment. It resembles such acclaimed recent releases such as Past Lives and All of Us Strangers in its presentation of protagonists whose intellectual and cultural lives are portrayed only to the extent that they serve the plot. Today, the labor of movies is increasingly being outsourced to viewers. Many films are basically kits that require the audiences to do the work of not merely interpretation, but of characterization based on a handful of clues. For Lou, these details are her sisterly bond with Beth and her criminal one with the father she hates. As for Jackie, she was adopted at 13, a bullied fat kid who therefore learned to fight, and then fled the religious narrowness of her hometown in rural Oklahoma. Those specifics frame Love Lies Bleeding as a game of cinematic Mad Libs, inviting viewers to fill in the blanks with whatever traits, interests, inclinations, enthusiasms, and backstories they like. And then he goes on to say, or maybe it was earlier, that Lou's traumatic past is examined only as much as is necessary to establish in a series of quick flashbacks her participation in her father's crimes. The movie, cutting from one plot point to the next, doesn't give the two women much space or time for the sorts of offhand conversations that reveal character. They share few confidences and disclose no observations or opinions, no tastes or distastes. What they do share is sexual desire. Their mutual attraction is the movie's prime force. Most of the sex scenes, while forthright, are conventional with rounds of writhing and panting, but one of them, rooted in the couple's explicit talk about pleasure, is unusual and acute. Ultimately, though, desire seems to be all that defines the women's bonds. I think this is so problematic. I would link it to what I said earlier about, I was like, this is such a fundamental misunderstanding of lesbians. I feel like lesbians would absolutely meet and hook up, and it would be all about their desire. There is something somewhat like latching on and immediate to a lot of like these connections. So I was like, I didn't really think that centering desire was an issue. I also think that in this quote, he contradicts himself because he gives quite a few examples of really good characters. Like we know quite a lot about the characters, even as Brody is trying to convince us that the characterization is poor. And I think we've talked about on the podcast about how in horror and also thriller, we don't have a lot of space for characterization, so you do need to be craftier and a bit hintier about it.
I also think that he has like missed a lot of the subtleties in like what drives characterization. And a lot of this is, like you said, probably not quite understanding like the different dynamics in a queer or lesbian relationship. I think it's also, listen, I don't know this critic at all, but I think that something I've noticed about male critics, male film goers, is that they like films that talk at them because they're cerebral. And Christopher Nolan is so fucking great because it's men talking for hours. They do not understand subtlety. And the idea that he's criticizing this film because it's centering desire is because they cannot read subtext. And so anything that's just show and not tell, they're like, well, there's no characterization. And I'm like, do you know that film is a visual fucking language? Fine, you can critique like a little bit of, I don't know, the character's motivations or like, but to call it something like that doesn't engage with the world in which they live in, where there are so many like very delicately put clues to the like pop culture landscape that we've talked about now, like he just doesn't get it. If you don't get it, you don't get it.
The girls that get it.
The characterization in this film I think is really interesting actually because it is subtle. Like Lou Sr. owning a gym and a gun range instead of like a strip club or like a nightclub or a bar or something that would be more closely associated with crime dealings is like very similar to how Jackie in this movie is obsessed with the ideal of appearing strong. He has two things that make you stronger, a gym and a gun range, in which you would have power in both of those places and make yourself undefeatable, as he seems to be in the film. And he's like the final boss, quote unquote, they both have to defeat. And also the way that like Lou is drawn to the Jackie, who is kind of like emulating the same thing, and she's also involved in the two places of the gun range and the gym. Like those subtle things that Rose Glass does with the characters and like how they sort of dance around the narrative are really interesting. And it takes, I think, a lot of effort and thought to create a script where you don't have the characters sit down and say their desires and their motivations, but it's still clear to the audience. And I think like that is a lot more valuable than people just spitting out what it is to you.
Trying to think about what we've all learned from this reviewing experience. I think we all agree on the fact that we enjoy seeing like these complex, like fucked up characters on screen. I personally, what I liked and thought was very generous in the film is that whole like Easter eggs. And I think like a kid watching a film today, I think that gives them a bunch of references to go into like queer history and some of the more like radical pioneers we owe so much to. And I think that was a really important like part, I think, in this film, and moving away from like the sanitized aspect and being a more of a, I don't know, like a walkway into like more radical archives as well. Like watching the film, and based on what we were saying, I was like, I should maybe also get into like bodybuilding or martial arts, because like the revolution is coming and I need to be like physically prepared for that. Like I don't want to miss out.
Yeah, I relate to that. So Ethel Cain, some more queer history for you guys. Ethel Cain.
Stop.
Ethel Cain posted a story like posing, like bodybuilder posing in front of the Love Lies Bleeding poster. She went to go see it and I screenshotted it. I was like, I'm going to need this one day. And then today I tried to like recreate it. And then I like forced my friend. I was like, you have to, we were there for like 5 minutes. I was trying to get this pose right. And looking back on it, I'm like, my form is atrocious. Like I need to get into some kind of fitness regime.
Thank you, Reem, so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I had a great time.
Happy Pride, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Monstrous Feminine podcast, produced and hosted by Zeba Aurora, Tyia Burnett, Mila F., and Louisa Johnson. Big thanks also go to Sebastian Pizarro for our wonderful theme music. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, SoundCloud, and Spotify at The Monstrous Feminine Podcast, and on Twitter at The MonFemPod. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and Substack, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and follow us on TikTok at The Monstrous Feminine Pod for podcast clips and more fun. All information can be found on our website, www.themonstrousfemininepodcast.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Brooms up, witches out.